Hello, I'm Norman Lamb, Sir Norman Lamb, if you really want, and I'm the Member of Parliament for North Norfolk, and I've been a health minister in my time in the coalition government, and you're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what...
Order, and welcome to the inaugural session of Politically Cannabis. I'm the Right Dishonourable Oscar Houseman, and with me is my ungentlemanly friend, Jonathan Weiser. So, Jonathan, who do we have speaking in the chamber today?
Today in the chamber, we have a member of the UK Parliament, Sir Norman Lamb, MP for North Norfolk and a member of the Liberal Democrats Party. Oscar, our studio was meant to be in Westminster today, but I find ourselves sat in the same place. Why is that?
Yes, I would have loved to take up Norman's invitation to meet in Westminster, but it seems our new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has determined that all MPs should go home and do something. I'm not sure. Let's let Norman explain. He's an MP. He might have a clue what's going on.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow?
For this special episode of Professionally Cannabis Meets, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by a knight of the realm, none other than Sir Norman Lamb, member of the UK Parliament, representing the constituency of North Norfolk. Having served as an MP since 2001, Norman has, amongst many things, tirelessly campaigned for reform to drug legislation, making him our kind of politician. Norman, a great pleasure to have you with us on Professionally Cannabis.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for joining us, Norman. And so typically we start the interview process with a question about what led you to the plant. But because this is such an exciting time in UK politics, I was wondering if you could help our listeners, who are for the most part international and cannabis focused, understand why we're not taking this interview face-to-face in Westminster today.
Well, because we're in the middle of a political and a constitutional crisis, and our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has effectively closed down Parliament, which is his prerogative. He can go to the Queen and ask for what's called a prorogation of Parliament, which brings the session of Parliament to an end, and it restarts in about 5 weeks. Now, we were due to shut down for 3 weeks for our party conferences, which is a standard annual event, but this is longer than usual, and many of us who are not in government are of the clear view that it's designed to frustrate those who don't agree with Boris Johnson on his approach to Brexit. And so we're all dispersed far and wide. I'm back in my home in Norwich and enjoying lovely sunshine here, but we ought really to be in Parliament scrutinising what government's doing.
Yes, you said longer than usual. I believe this is the longest prorogation for 90 years, I think I saw in the papers.
Yeah, I think that's right. Something like that. There have been occasions when we have long prorogations. The question is why on this occasion? And with the departure from the EU scheduled for the end of October, many people believe that this was designed to frustrate opposition to Boris Johnson's plans.
Now, Norman, the Liberal Democrats, which is the political party Norman represents, has typically had a rather open-minded view on drug policy and a progressive stance around legislation. Were your own views towards drugs a key driver towards you joining the party, or was it indeed the party itself which helped shape your own position on drugs?
It wasn't a reason for joining the party in the first place. I guess at that stage I hadn't really thought that much about drug policy, but as I have spent time in Parliament debating a whole range of issues with opponents and so on, you start to shape your views on a range of issues. And the starting point in a way for me is one's approach as a liberal. And John Stuart Mill, the liberal philosopher, talked about how the state shouldn't interfere on those issues which adults do, which only affect themselves. The state should only have a role in interfering in creating criminal offences and so forth, where an adult does something to someone else that adversely affects that other person. And so for me, in a way, as a liberal, that's my starting point. Why are we prosecuting someone for using a particular drug of choice, particularly when in our Parliament building, parliamentarians consume quite a lot of their drug of choice, which of course is alcohol, which on the evidence appears to be significantly more dangerous than cannabis. And, I don't like, therefore, the hypocrisy of this. And when you start to see around the world different countries and states in America taking a different approach, and critically for me, applying evidence of what works and what's effective, then inevitably I'm driven to following the evidence. And I was fascinated in what they did in Portugal many years ago now. I visited Portugal whilst I was part of the coalition government. Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, was keen for me to go. He is also a reformer. I was impressed by the impact that decriminalisation has had in Portugal. But I then started to think more about whether decriminalisation was a sufficient response to the situation. And of course, I realised that it makes much more sense to actively regulate the market and to take it away from organised crime and to protect particularly young people more effectively through a regulated market.
And I think here's probably a nice time for us to ask you, can you spell out what the Liberal Democrat policy is, specifically on cannabis? Although I am personally interested in what the wider drug reform movement looks like from the Lib Dem perspective.
Yeah, so the starting point of us rethinking our position, we had been in favour of decriminalisation for some time. So getting criminal courts out of the sort of response to cannabis use, or indeed to the use of any drug. So we had an established position of favouring decriminalisation. But I then decided to, as the Shadow Health Secretary of State, the formal title, but the spokesperson on health, I decided to appoint an independent expert panel to look at how one might go about regulating the cannabis market. I focused specifically on cannabis. We brought onto that expert panel a range of highly respected scientists, including Professor David Nutt.
When was this? Was this after or before he'd been sacked from the advisory?
A long time after. This was back in 2015. We brought in a serving chief constable from Durham.
Was that Mike Barton?
Mike Barton, a retired chief constable from Cambridgeshire. And it was under the chair of Steve Rolls, who was a very respected cannabis reformer, drug law reformer. And they came up with a set of recommendations for the party to consider. They weren't party members, it was independent of the party. But their approach was basically to say that it is in the interests of public health, critical conclusion, in the interests of public health, not despite concerns about public health, in the interests of public health, to regulate the market, to protect in particular young people from any harm. Their recommendation was to start with quite a strictly controlled market and to review after 1 or 2 years, and if necessary, then to tweak the framework. But it's easier to start strict and then review and relax if appropriate, rather than to have a free-for-all and then try to control it. So I think in that way, really importantly, you start to build public trust. You reassure people that this is not going to be a free-for-all. This is not about just promoting drug use. This is about a rational, evidence-based response to the issue of drug use in society, which we now know is there, whatever the government and the law enforcement agencies try to do. One of the things we did in government during the coalition, my colleague at the time, Norman Baker, who was a Home Office minister, commissioned a study by the Home Office looking at the international evidence of the relationship between the toughness of your regime, your enforcement regime, and the levels of drug use. And they found no link at all. So having a very tough regime, the Home Office found, doesn't lead to reduced cannabis use. And so if that's a conclusion that we can rely on, then seems to be that we have to learn lessons from that and to follow a much more rational approach.
Interesting. And one of the points you just raised there was looking at examples internationally. So I think this is perhaps a dual question, because there's at the level of the Liberal Democrat Party, but also at the level of the UK national government. What sort of international evidence do you think will be required or even accepted? Are there particular countries of interest? I know, for instance, I prefer or quite admire the Danish model for medicinal cannabis in Europe.
Well, I think what we're witnessing at the moment is quite a dramatic shifting of the landscape, particularly across Europe, with more countries looking to adjust their approach. And of course, the backdrop to all of this is some extremely unhelpful treaties at the UN, which are designed to prevent countries from legalizing cannabis or any other prescribed drug.
Legalizing for recreational or adult use, I think there's an important clarification to make.
Yeah, that's right. The treaties are in need of urgent revocation, in my view, because they actually sanction and facilitate really draconian regimes in some countries, which wholly breach people's human rights. But we're seeing this sort of quite radical shift, particularly across Europe, but also in other countries as well. So we need to be learning constantly from this changing landscape. The Danish approach is certainly attractive. What we see, incidentally, you'll be very familiar with this, is that wherever countries have legalized the use of cannabis for medicinal purposes, it tends to then remove the mystique, the fear that attaches to cannabis, and public opinion then shifts its attitude towards the legalization of cannabis for recreational purposes. Having said that, what's extraordinary in the UK is that public opinion has already shifted dramatically. It's way ahead of the politicians on this. The latest polling I've seen has support for legalization for recreational purposes at above 50%, with opposition down to the low 30s. So this is a really fascinating and quite significant change of attitude over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually recently there was another poll that came out of Scotland that echoed similar results to that. Now, you recently took part in a trip to Canada alongside 2 other MPs. One of them, David Lammy, actually, will be joining you as a speaker at the Thought Leadership Conference in London this November, GCI Europe. Please, could you tell us a little bit more about your trip and your key learnings from being out there?
We had 3 days in Toronto. We were able to meet with police chiefs, including senior police officers who had been appointed to the panel that was established by the government, which was established to give advice to government on the design of the regulatory system that should apply in Canada. And it was fascinating to hear from those police officers who said that at the start of the whole process, when they were first asked to join the panel, they had been quite hostile to the idea of legalization, but they agreed to participate because they thought it was better that they played a part rather than stood back and complained. And the process of going through the work of the panel led them to change their mind. And that was really interesting. And so we visited a cannabis outlet in Toronto.
Did you make any purchases?
Yes, I did. And I felt that it was sensible to actually see what this was about. I'm perhaps an unusual reformer in that I haven't been a user of cannabis. It doesn't particularly appeal to me for recreational purposes at all. But we have sons who I'm quite sure have both used cannabis, and we have the anxieties of any parents about the health and well-being of their children. But my interest was that I don't sleep particularly well. And I'd heard that cannabis was quite good for getting a good night's sleep. So I thought, well, I'll get advice about which cannabis oil was the best to use for a good night's sleep. I got that advice.
A nice indica strain?
Well, it was getting the balance, of course, of the CBD and the THC correct. And I was advised to take, half the dose to start with. And I did that and I got 2 good nights' sleep. I was filmed by the BBC. And what amused me in a way was that this was a great sort of shock horror MP filmed taking cannabis. And part of my motivation for doing this was to demonstrate just how ridiculous this is, that Here I was in my hotel bedroom taking 4 drops of cannabis under my tongue in order to get a good night's sleep. And that would have been a criminal act in the UK. And how ludicrous is that? And I think when people see it like that, they begin to think, yeah, this is a bit stupid. There are more important things for our police forces to be focusing on. And then, of course, I had my journey home, and I happened to have a meeting of the Select Committee, the Science and Technology Select Committee, which I happened to chair on the day I returned to the UK. I was due to land early in the morning. And so I wanted to sleep on the plane. So I took my cannabis oil on the plane, but I had to dispose of it in the loo because to bring it back into the UK would have been a criminal offence. Now, how ridiculous is that? So, I wanted to highlight this to the country, as it were, through the means of the BBC, just to say, come on, let's take a more rational approach to this. Let's recognise the potential benefits that cannabis can offer to very many people. And interestingly, I've also, I've had a number of middle-aged constituents coming to see me in my advice surgery who use cannabis for all sorts of ailments, aches and pains, sometimes acute pain. They find that it's effective in addressing that pain. And interestingly, one of them described to me how the NHS had put him onto highly addictive opioids to confront acute pain. And he was frightened by the risk of becoming addicted and potentially the risk then of overdosing and death, which we're seeing on a horrific scale in the United States. So the NHS facilitates access to very addictive opiates. And at the same time, we don't allow access to cannabis for that pain relief. So again, it's a ludicrous situation.
And presumably within your trip to Canada, where adult use is very much legal now, you weren't walking down the streets where on each corner there was a tannoy blasting out reggae music and children walking down the street smoking blunts or anything like that.
The sky hadn't fallen in.
The sky hadn't fallen in, bizarrely. Canada remains what I could see as a pretty law-abiding country, if anything, slightly boring.
Are you implying that crimes are interesting and fun?
But it was sort of like they are just behaving more rationally than our parliament. I've got immense admiration for the sister party to the Lib Dems, the Liberal Party of Canada, for putting it in their manifesto, for getting elected and for getting on with legislating and doing this. And the world hasn't caved in. And now there's a very interesting debate going on in Canada on something that I think is incredibly important. There is an argument for expungement of criminal records of all of those people who've been convicted of cannabis offences in the past. Of course, most of whom are from the poorest communities, many of whom are from minority ethnic groups. And of course, that completely blights their career and prevents them from playing an economic part in society, prevents them bizarrely, of course, from getting jobs in the new thriving cannabis industry, which is the biggest job creator at present in Canada. So this needs to also be used, in my view, as a vehicle for social justice. And I'm fascinated also, one of the other aspects of the prohibition of drugs, which rarely gets talked about because it's awkward for governments that endorse prohibition, but the link between the illegal drugs trade and acute and severe violence in our poorest communities is clear and obvious, and no one talks about it. But we are witnessing a horrible increase in gun and knife crime in our capital city and in other cities around our country. And much of this is associated with the illegal trade in drugs. And of course, if your market is a particular housing estate in a city, London, and someone else tries to get in on your patch, they don't go to the High Court to get an injunction. They use extreme violence. There's plenty of evidence for this. And so that's another very important reason why we should be rethinking our approach to drugs. And we start with cannabis and make the evidence-based approach for a more rational attitude towards cannabis and for regulating it rather than leaving it in the hands of organised crime.
And to look at the UK government and politicians themselves, there does seem to be a real great paradox between what many politicians personally think about drugs and what they're outwardly willing to admit they think about drugs to the public. You know, you just need to look at the most recent election campaign for the Conservative Party, in which you had Michael Gove admitting that he's frequently taking cocaine. Boris Johnson, who's now the Prime Minister, on cocaine has said it achieved no pharmacological or psychotropic or any other effect on me whatsoever. Rory Stewart smoking opium at weddings, Jeremy Hunt drinking cannabis lassies, and a whole ream of others who have said they've tried these drugs, but luckily they had no effect on them. I guess what I want to know is, if you have all of these folks playing politics and playing to what they think is the crowd, how are we ever going to break the mould and move towards progressive drug policy? And also, where are all of these MPs getting these terrible drugs from?
Well, frankly, I found it obscene, actually, these excruciating admissions by contenders to become our Prime Minister of past misdemeanours. And they all affect this sorrow of their past guilt and the fact that they have seen the error of their ways and are now committed to the straight and narrow. But they are happy to criminalise many other fellow citizens for doing precisely what they have done. And they know, if they're honest about it, that most of them public school boys, not all, but with money in their families to avoid any risk of prosecution, to fight off threats of prosecution if ever they got in trouble in their teenage student years, whilst at the same time a black kid from Peckham in South London ends up with a criminal conviction. This is actually quite disgusting, and there is no social justice here. And they need to recognise the hypocrisy and start behaving in a way that treats every citizen equally and recognises that actually doing what they did should not be criminalised in the first place. And I think if we adopt that approach, everyone would be better off.
And I think that's a great goal. The social justice element of regularization, legalization can't be ignored. But to me, it sounded like your answer was quite lofty. Do you have a nuts and bolts on the ground tactical approach to it? Because from what I can see, it's basically been since that photo of George Osborne with the line of white powder on the table, pretty politically accepted that our politicians are involved in some way in drugs. And yet there's been no apparent pressure to change any of the rulings, criminalization of those who are less fortunate who get involved in it, or anything really that makes change on the ground. I suppose we could talk about lower arrest numbers for cannabis possession.
Yeah, so what's happening on the ground, but this is in itself not acceptable, is that many police forces, and indeed police and crime commissioners, these are the elected people that have stewardship over local police forces, where these people are rationalists and take a more liberal view, they are changing the facts on the ground by not prosecuting, not giving cautions to individuals found in possession. But in other parts of the country, the same approach isn't taken, and people end up with a criminal conviction for something that somewhere else they would be of no interest to the police. So you've got a sort of postcode lottery across our country, and it shouldn't ultimately be police forces often acting because of stressed resources. It shouldn't be down to them to change our approach to drugs. It should be down to our elected parliament and to governments to lead on reform. Practical measures, well, I think probably the most likely thing is that we end up in this country with an effective legalization and regulation of medicinal cannabis. What's happened so far is in itself is quite a significant psychological hurdle that we've cleared. The government actually saying that they are legalizing cannabis for medicinal use. It's just that the framework that's in place isn't actually enabling anyone to get access to cannabis under our NHS. So we need to change the rules to make cannabis accessible for medicinal purposes. And I think that in itself will then change the whole debate about within political circles, because the public has already moved on, but within political circles about recreational use. The other potential route to reform is that parties with a clear manifesto commitment to reform, such as the Lib Dems, suddenly find themselves in government. And one can't discount anything at the moment. We're in very unpredictable times.
Understatement.
Exactly. And, at the end of the Canada trip, I said to the BBC that I wouldn't be at all surprised if reform had happened on cannabis within 5 years. I just think that the pace of change now across the world has increased so much, and public opinion will start to demand it, and eventually political parties will react to that change in public mood.
I think we've talked to a lot of the, let's call it the civil points around cannabis. So patient access is very important, social justice, that sort of civil liberties bent. I wonder if we could swap over to looking at it from a more business aspect.
Economic point of view.
Yeah, an economic point of view. So a lot of people in the cannabis industry think Brexit will be a point where we need to perhaps change or readjust our focuses away from services and maybe bring back some manufacturing. And many people are very bullish about cannabis's ability to provide those jobs. You mentioned the jobs growth in Canada. I wonder, what's your thought on the economics of cannabis reform?
Well, the first point to make, which is interesting, is when we were in government, we also commissioned a study by the Treasury into the potential tax take from a legal regulated market for cannabis. And the view was in that study that it could be up to £1 billion in tax take, which sort of demonstrates the potential size of the market here. And I have no difficulty at all with a responsible cannabis industry, properly regulated, as I've said. I've said that my view is you should start with quite a strict regulatory regime because you've got to build public confidence in the new system. This is ultimately quite a significant social reform that's happening, shifting a whole market from criminal market to a legal regulated market. Hasn't happened very often in our history, and affecting that change without unintended consequences requires careful design. And there's a sort of continuum between one end a criminal market and the other end a complete free-for-all. And getting the place right on that continuum is quite a sophisticated exercise. If you have too strict controls, I totally understand you don't undermine the criminal market and therefore you fail to achieve your objective. If you move too far in the other direction, for example, making very potent products easily available to young people, then we risk health consequences, adverse health consequences.
So you might consider taxing on the basis of potency to disincentivize?
Yes, I would, which interestingly they haven't done in Canada. They've talked about it, and I think the framework could deliver that, but at the moment that's not what they've done. And our expert panel also recommended starting with a cap on potency. Now, not everyone agrees with that. They haven't done that in Canada. But I think in terms of public reassurance, that's quite a sensible, rational approach to establish a regulatory framework at the start of this.
Interesting. And while we're talking about regulatory frameworks and the economics of cannabis reform, something that's cropped up in the UK media, I think especially at the launch of Crispin Blunt's Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, is the fact that well-capitalized international cannabis companies are trying to influence the regulations here, and some see that as poachers trying to become gamekeepers. I'm wondering, how do you see the influence of what might be called big cannabis by the naysayers on the market and the regulators?
Well, I think, first of all, it's inevitable that there's a clear economic interest there, and they have a stake in seeking to influence the design of the of the framework. I think in terms of reassuring the public and therefore actually achieving the goal of legalization, because unless we actually legalize, we don't achieve anything. So I think in order to legalize, to get public acceptance, to get politicians on side, we need to adopt a cautious approach, and we need to avoid accusations that we are in the pockets of big cannabis, as you describe it, because that just then undermines the case and runs the risk of the reform not happening at all. And so I just think for everyone to be smart, let's do it in an objective way that isn't influenced by money in any way, that listens to all sides and designs a regulatory framework that builds on the experiences of other countries and that seeks to approach it on the basis of harm reduction. That for me is a very important objective, because if we're to make the case for reform, I think we have to learn the lessons from Canada. Justin Trudeau's argument to the public was, we are not protecting young people effectively, leaving things as they are. And there was real power and force to that argument, because, in this country, on the streets of London, you can get the most potent strains. And if you're a teenager, without getting any advice from any public education program or through labeling of products or anything, you are just getting product on the street. You could be routinely, day by day, using highly potent strains of cannabis and potentially putting your mental health at risk. So that is clear. We are under the current situation that this government in our country endorses, putting young people at risk of harming their mental health. That is intolerable. That is in itself a reason for change. And on top of that, the argument that we can take billions of pounds away from organised crime and tax a product so that we raise money for public goods like spending on the NHS, on police, on schools, then the public will start to see that there is a powerful case for change. So I think we have to be very clear and disciplined in our message about why we're doing this, and disciplined in avoiding the risks of being accused of being in the pockets of big financial interests.
Very well said. So in summary, keep drugs out of the hands of children and drug money out of the hands of criminals.
Perfect. That's it. That's it.
And Norman, looking at your own career, so you recently announced that you won't be restanding again at the next general election. What next for you? Are you looking for a next step in the private sector, perhaps a quango, or are you going to take a little bit of time to prune the garden?
I'm absolutely not in the mood for giving up. I feel, and I'm quite distressed about this, that Parliament at the moment is not a fruitful place for getting things done, with its obsession with the Brexit question. And I feel in many respects that I can have more impact on the issues that I care a lot about on the outside at the present time. I've also done over 18 years of really intense effort, usually 7 days a week, and I need to recharge my batteries and then take on new challenges. And I want to continue at a national level, perhaps an international level, to pursue the causes that I care about, which are equality for people who experience mental ill health. That's a cause that I am passionate about. We routinely trample over the human rights of people who experience mental ill health. And of course, there's a link with the whole debate about drugs, because quite often people with mental ill health self-medicate to escape from the distress of what they're going through. And then as a society, we criminalize them for doing that, which is an extraordinary response to people's distress. So I want to pursue those causes. I want to pursue the cause of drug law reform, and also to support people with learning disability, with autism and so forth, who also suffer injustice and are treated like second-class citizens. So I remain, and indeed probably I feel more angry about injustice than I ever have done. And I'm not planning to give up on those causes anytime soon. It's a leap into the dark. I have no idea what opportunities, public or private, will come up. But after a period of recharging and of reflection, I'm ready to go again.
Well, Norman, one would imagine you'll be a man in high demand.
Who knows?
Thank you so much for joining us on Professionally Cannabis.
It's a great pleasure. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Hear, hear. Well, that was a jolly good speech from the dispatch box. Until next time, session adjourned.
Please take me above, take me with you.